The rule was that the stubs went on the fire and the fire was watched. Nobody had ever thought to ask who watched the woman watching the fire. 11 years of stubs, rendered, scented, and sold under another name entirely. Then his own Chandler knocked, hat in hand, with an order nobody could fill. The tray was pewter, dented at one corner, and it held 300 candle ends. Hannah Wren set it on the scullery table at 4:15 in the morning and rolled her sleeves back above the elbow without thinking about it, the way she had rolled them every quarter day for 11 years. Her apron was already stained honey yellow at the hip where she braced things against her body. Her left thumb caught the firelight, glossed permanently with wax, smooth as a river stone, the way a smith's palm goes shiny. She stood straight-backed, chin level, hands clasped low in front of her, and looked at the hearth the way you look at a debt. 300 stubs, beeswax from the staterooms, tallow from the servants' passages, a few fat mongrel ends from the chapel that were mostly wick and grit. Together they weighed a little over 11 pounds. 11 pounds of good wax, and the rule at Calverton Hall was that it went on the fire. Not sold, not remolded, not handed down to the underservants for their own dark rooms. Burned. Here's why, and I want you to sit with it, because it's the exact flavor of stupid that only money can afford. 60 years back, some Calverton butler had been caught selling candle ends in the village for pocket coin, so the house made a rule. Every quarter, all stubs to be gathered, weighed, and destroyed in the presence of the steward's clerk. The weight entered in the estate accounts under waste, household, consumed. Mr. Thomas Fairley kept that ledger under his left arm like a man carrying scripture. 6 foot of black frock coat and flat black hair, and small, round, steel-rimmed spectacles, he pushed up his nose with one knuckle before writing a number down. 11 pounds of wax, at market, was worth roughly 18 shillings. The estate paid a man's half-day wage to stand in a hot scullery and watch it turn into smoke. That's the arithmetic. They spent money to burn money, on purpose, so that nobody beneath them could have anything. Fairley had explained it to her once, back when she was 20 and still asked questions. He had looked down through those spectacles at her plain, coiled knot of dark honey-brown hair and her scuffed half-boots, and said in a voice you'd use on a slow dog, "The value is not in the wax, Wren. The value is in the servants knowing they cannot have it." That is a man telling you out loud that your hunger is a management tool. She had not argued. She never argued. She had said, "Yes, sir," and gone back down the cold flagged corridor, and something in her had gone quiet and hard and stayed that way. The collection itself took her the whole night before. That was the part nobody counted. Beginning at 11, when the house went dark, up through the long gallery with a shielded lamp, easing each stub out of its socket with the flat of her thumbnail so as not to score the silver. 41 sconces on the first floor alone. The candle cups in the blue drawing room had to be scraped because the tallow there ran and pooled and set hard as bone. The chapel sticks were brass and cold enough in January to sting through wool. Down the back stairs with the sack on her hip, and always over the 4th stair from the bottom, which creaked like a cat being stepped on, and which she had learned to skip when she was 20 years old, and had never once forgotten since. Mrs. Agnes Perry heard that stair the way other women hear their own name. 63 years old, 5'2", iron gray hair drawn into a bun so tight it looked structural, black bombazine, iron keys chiming at her waist. She missed nothing. She stood at the top of the kitchen passage on quarter-day mornings, with her hands folded at her waist, and her pale blue eyes going over the tray, the sack, the girl, and she never said a word about any of it. She never counted the sack either. Understand that. 11 years, and Mrs. Perry never once counted. Because here is the thing about the fire that was watched. 11 years ago, in the November after old Bess Cade died, Hannah Wren came down that corridor with the sack on her hip and did not turn left toward the scullery. She turned right, through the low door, past the herb beds gone to seed, and out the kitchen garden gate, and she set 2/3 of the weight down in the dark under the wall and covered it with sacking. Then she went back in, burned the other third loud and smoky and generous, and stood there straight-backed while Fairley's clerk wrote the number down. The number was always right. She made sure of it. Wet tallow burns heavy and stinks. Ash weight is a guess. And the man doing the weighing had never in his life touched wax, and did not want to. He wanted to be somewhere warm. He wrote what she told him the sack had held, because who was going to check the arithmetic of a stillroom maid? Nobody. That was the entire security system. contempt. Bess Cade had been the Calverton stillroom woman for 39 years, and she had taken Hannah on at 20 because the girl had steady hands and did not chatter. Bess taught her to render, to strain, to clarify, to test a wax by the sound it made cooling. Bess called every rule in that house by its right name, quietly, and then went on working. And when Bess died in the October of that year, sitting up in her chair with her spectacles on, she left behind one object, and it was not money. A small receipt book, brass at the corners, the cover worn pale along the spine. It lived in Hannah's apron pocket now. It had lived there for 11 years. That night, in her mother's sister's cottage down the lane, she washed her hands, sat down at the scrub table with a rushlight, and opened it to the page she always opened to. Bess's hand, cramped and certain, stopping mid-sentence where the pen had simply been set down and never taken up again. Waste is only a failure of imagination. The page stops mid-sentence because the woman who wrote it died with the pen in her hand, and Hannah Wren reads the half-line under it anyway. 2 parts true wax to 1 of clarified tallow, and no more, or you will have a candle that weeps. She'd hauled home 11 pounds of scrapings that afternoon. Not a gift. Rubbish. The hall's Chandler had condemned it as spoilt sweepings and told a scullery girl to dump it, and Hannah had asked for it instead, and Silas Brent had laughed with his hat at his chest and told her she was welcome to the floor of the room while she was at it. So, 11 pounds of floor. Here's the thing nobody at Calverton Hall bothered to learn, because learning is for people who don't have a title to hide behind. Tallow and beeswax are not the same substance, and they never were. Tallow is rendered fat, beef and mutton drippings, soft, low melting, and it stinks when it burns because the fat's still carrying the meat with it. Beeswax is a different animal entirely. It melts high, it sets hard, it burns clean and slow and smells faintly of honey and the inside of a hive. Mixed sweepings look like one gray mess in a bucket. They are not. She sorted them on the cottage table with her thumbnail. Wax cracks, tallow smears. The permanently wax-glossed left thumb of hers, she'd had it since she was 19, and it will be there the day she dies. Did the sorting almost by itself, sleeves pinned back above the elbow, loose strands escaping the coiled knot at her nape and sticking to her damp temple. Then the render. Not over direct flame. The fire will scorch wax, and scorched wax goes brown and sour and never comes back. A pot inside a pot. Water in the outer, the way you'd cook a custard. Slow. She held it there an hour and a half, skimming gray scum off the top, and then she strained it through linen. Then again. Then a third time, and that third pass is the one that matters, because the grit you can't see is what makes a candle spit at 11 o'clock at night when someone's trying to read. The first batch was beautiful, and it burned like a chimney fire. Guttered in 9 minutes. Black smoke, a flame the height of her thumb, wax pouring down the outside in fat tears. She stood and watched it fail and did not swear once. She measured the wick between her fingers instead. 12 strands of plaited cotton, near enough what the hall used, but the hall's candles were the width of a broom handle, and hers were half an inch across. A wick that thick drinks more melt than a slim candle can supply, so it starts eating the body of the candle itself, and there's your smoke and your weeping and your wasted evening. Wick to diameter. That's the whole secret, and she wrote it in the brass-cornered receipt book in her own hand, under the dead woman's, in a line that would sit there for 30 years. 9 strands to the half-inch, 12 to the 3/4, and never guess. Batch 2 was for scent. She cut rosemary from the wall by the privy, green and fresh and stiff with rain, and dropped it straight into hot wax like a woman making soup. Water and wax loathe each other. Every drop trapped in those needles flashed to steam and threw molten wax back at her wrist, and the finished candles hissed and popped all evening like something angry in a cupboard. 2 pounds ruined. That's 1 shilling and 8 pence at any honest reckoning, and she didn't have 1 shilling and 8 pence. So she dried the herb. 3 weeks hanging from a nail in the cold end of the room until the needles snapped instead of bending. And she learned the second thing. You don't bloom scent in boiling wax, because heat carries the smell straight up the chimney and leaves you nothing. You pull the pot off the fire, let it cool until a skin starts at the edge, and steep it then. Warm, not hot. 20 minutes. Strain, cast, cure 4 days. Batch 3 cooled hard, pale, faintly green about the smell, and burned 1 hour and 40 minutes to the inch without a single tear down its side. Word doesn't travel fast in a county like that. It travels quietly, which is worse for the people it travels around. A milliner in Bath sent her own servant 40 miles on an errand for hat straw, and that servant stopped for the night at the Bell, and the room she slept in had 2 of Hannah's candles in it, and she asked the landlady what in God's name they were burning. She bought 6 pair the next morning at the cottage door and paid without arguing, which nobody had ever done in Hannah's life. 1 6 the pound. That was the private price. The hall paid Brent 2 3 for candles that smoked. The kitchen found out, naturally. Kitchens always do. The maid who plays at trade, Silas Brent said, ruddy and pleased with himself, tin wick gauge tapping his breast pocket, hat at his chest and his weight back on his heels. Give her a season. Girls like that always come crawling back for the wage, and she'll be lucky if I've a place left to give her. Grateful is what she ought to be. She was nothing here, and she'll be nothing there. He said it in a room where 11 people could hear him, which tells you exactly how safe he thought he was. Hannah heard it. She was carrying a bucket at the time. She did not stop, did not answer, did not so much as turn her head, straight-backed, chin level, freckles across the nose and cheekbones, the brass-cornered book knocking against her hip in the apron pocket. She went home and made a 4th batch. 2 parts wax, 1 part clarified tallow, 9 strands to the half-inch. Dried rosemary bloomed off the heat. It cooled hard and white as a good soap, and it burned 2 hours and 10 minutes to the inch, a full 40 minutes longer than anything Calverton Hall put on its own table. The bath servant's mistress wrote asking terms. Hannah named her price. The 5th morning after that, she's got the dipping frame in both hands, 12 wicks hanging straight down off the crossbar, and she's counting under her breath the way her aunt taught her. Dip, lift, count to 40, dip again. When the light in the stillroom doorway goes, not dims, goes. She doesn't turn around. That's the thing you have to understand about Hannah Wren. A shadow across her work is a variable, and variables get handled after the wick is set. Her sleeves are pinned back above the elbow, wax to the wrist, the left thumb glossy the way it's been glossy for 11 years, and the coiled knot at her nape has shed 2 strands at the temple like it always does by 9 o'clock. She lifts, she counts. She lowers the frame into the kettle where the tallow sits at 140 degrees exactly, because at 150 the layers won't hold, and at 130 they set lumpy, and she learned both of those the hard way with 8 ruined pounds of fat and a whole afternoon of nothing. Behind her, the Duke of Calverton says nothing at all. He'd come down for the estate ledgers, or so he told himself. Fairly kept a duplicate set in the steward's room, and the steward's room shares a wall with the still room, and the door was open, and the smell was wrong. Not the sour reek of a rendering shed, but something clean, faintly sharp, like vinegar cut with beeswax. So he'd looked in. And then he'd stayed in the doorway for 4 full minutes, military straight, one hand behind his back, watching a woman he'd never been introduced to lower a frame into a kettle with the unhurried precision of a surgeon. 12 dips. She hung the frame on the cooling rack. She started the 2nd frame. Why do you wait between them? She answered without stopping. Because if you don't let the layer harden, the next one melts it off and you've spent an hour making 1 thin candle instead of 12 fat ones. That's all. No curtsy in her voice. No, Your Grace, stitched onto the end like a apology for existing. Just the answer, given plainly, to a man who has not been spoken to plainly by anyone below the rank of Viscount since roughly 1809. Something in his chest came loose, and he had absolutely no idea what to call it. He asked how long the wicks were soaked. She told him, 12 hours in a saltpeter and lime solution, which is the whole reason his hall's candles gutter and hers don't, because the hall buys wick already spun and never soaks a thing. He turned the heavy gold signet on his right little finger with his thumb, once, and left without giving his name. He was back on Thursday. Something about the drainage survey and needing to check the yard's east wall. He was back on Friday, because the light was better in the morning for reading correspondence, and the stillroom corridor is, apparently, the only place in a house of 41 rooms with adequate light. Mrs. Agnes Perry counted. Of course she counted. 63 years old, 5'2", iron gray hair drawn hard into a low bun under the white cap, iron keys chiming at her waist with every small deliberate step. That woman has counted every crossing of that yard since the old Duke's time, and she is not about to stop now. 4 crossings on Tuesday, 6 on Thursday. She noted it, folded her hands at her waist, and said nothing to anybody. Meanwhile, in the steward's room on the other side of that wall, Mr. Thomas Fairley found a discrepancy. Here's the small noise. A column of figures, in a ledger, in a house where nobody reads the ledgers but him. Candle weight received against candle weight issued. Off by £9 a quarter. £9. That's less than the hall spends on lamp oil in a fortnight. And here's the catastrophic failure sitting underneath it, which Fairley did not yet see and Hannah did not yet say out loud. £9 a quarter across 11 years is roughly 400 pounds of tallow ends and drip tray scrapings that the hall threw into a barrel by the back gate, and which one woman carted off, rendered, filtered through cheesecloth twice, and rebuilt into candles that burn 2 hours longer than anything the Duke of Calverton has ever put in his own dining room. Small noise. £9 missing. Catastrophic failure. This estate has been paying a Chandler for 11 years to sell it back the fat it was already throwing away. Fairley didn't know that yet. What Fairley knew was that a number was untidy, and untidy numbers offend him the way a crooked picture offends other men. So he began, patiently, politely, with steel-rimmed spectacles pushed up and the accounts ledger tucked under his left arm, to find out where the tallow went. No accusation, no raised voice. Just a man in a black frock coat walking the yard with his hands clasped behind him, asking questions that sound like courtesy and land like a survey stake. Silas Brent, estate chandler, thick-necked and ruddy, hat held at his chest, told him exactly what he'd told everyone for 11 years. "That's rubbish out the back door, sir. Fit for soap, if that. There's nobody could make anything of it worth the carting." He said it with the flat contempt of a man who has decided a woman with a stained thumb is a joke he already finished telling. He'd been wrong for 11 years and had never once considered it. Mrs. Perry, that same week, in the servants' hall with her needlework in her lap and 3 maids pretending not to listen, watched the Duke pass the window for the second time in an hour and delivered the line the whole house would repeat for a decade. "He has never once asked after the still-room before." Then she went back to her hem, because there was a shape to that man's life already, and everyone below stairs knew it. Lady Sophia Vane, 26, £11,000, a family that has wanted Calverton land since the enclosures. And under it, quiet as rot in a joist, £4,000 of drainage debt on the West Fields that the estate cannot service and will not discuss. That marriage isn't a romance, it's a repayment schedule wearing a gown. And on the Monday following, Edmund Harrow stood at the still-room window with one hand behind his back, turning the signet ring with his thumb, watching a kettle he had no. 3 days later, Thomas Fairley came down to the servants' hall with his ledger under his left arm, set it on the scrubbed table like a magistrate setting down a warrant, and opened it to a page he had clearly prepared in advance. He did not sit. He never sat below stairs. He stood with his chin tucked and his hands behind his back, and let the silence do a little work first, because men like Fairley believe silence belongs to them. Then he asked her, in that flat, courteous voice, where 11 years of candle ends had gone. Here is the arithmetic he laid out, and give him this. The man could count. Calverton Hall burned roughly 300 stubs a quarter, 44 quarters since she came into the still-room. 13,200 ends, give or take a bad winter, swept off the sconces and dropped in the ash bucket and carted out as filth. At the rate the estate itself paid for beeswax, 4 shillings the pound, when Brent could get it, Fairley put the reclaimed weight at something above £400 sterling. £400, out of rubbish, out of the stuff the housemaids scraped into a pail with their thumbnails and cursed at. He said it like an accusation, because to him it was one. He tapped the column with one long finger and let his little steel-rimmed spectacles catch the light, and his voice never rose above the polite. "You have been stealing from His Grace for 11 years, he said, "and I doubt you were clever enough to know it. Women of your sort rarely are." That is what patient institutional cruelty sounds like. It smiles. It uses the word sort. Hannah Wren stood straight-backed with her hands clasped low in front of her, sleeves pinned back above the elbow, the honey-yellow stain across the hip of her apron catching lamplight, and she did not say a word. Her left thumb was wax-glossed to a permanent shine. The little brass-cornered receipt book sat in her pocket, and she did not take it out for him because he had not earned the sight of it. Then came the trap, wrapped in ribbon. Resign quietly. Take a character reference. A good one, he was prepared to be generous. No charges laid, no constable, no assize court, no ugliness for the family. She could be gone by Lady Day with her reputation intact and, he added, a position found for her 40 miles off where nobody had heard the word candle. And in exchange, the estate would take possession of the stillroom stock, the molds, the strained wax, the whole 11-year hoard, and the matter would end. Reasonable. God, it was reasonable. That is what makes it obscene. She looked at the ledger. She looked at him. Mrs. Agnes Perry stood by the dresser with her keys hanging still on their chain and her hands folded at her waist, watching, saying nothing. "That is not for sale," Hannah said. 4 words, and the room went cold as church stone in July. But the night after, the rain came in off the west, and this is the part nobody sees. She sat at her own kitchen table in the cottage with a single tallow dip guttering. Tallow, mind you, she never burned her own beeswax, not once. And the water hammered the slates and ran down the window in sheets, and she put her face in her hands. 31 years old, no family, no character reference now unless she took his terms. 11 years of scrapings, and a man with sparse brows and a ledger could unmake all of it before breakfast. She nearly took it. Let that sit. She nearly took it. Then she pulled the receipt book out of her apron and opened it at the page where her aunt's hand ran out mid-sentence and read the lines she had read at 8 years old and at 19 and at every hard hour since. Nothing is ruined until someone decides it is. She trimmed the wick. She went back out to the shed in the rain. Now, the weather. Nobody planned this. That summer had been wet and cold from May through August, the clover drowned, the lime blossoms stripped by storms, and the county's hives went into autumn light and came out of winter dead. Whole apiaries gone. The Wexford yards lost 9 skeps of 11. Beeswax went from 4 shillings the pound to 6 by Candlemas, and stood at 8 shillings by the following Michaelmas, and even at 8 there was none to be had, because the London Chandlers had emptied the Baltic, and the Baltic had nothing either. Great houses across 3 counties went back to tallow, and sat in rooms that smelled of boiled mutton fat and smoked black rings onto their own ceilings. And in a stone shed that smelled of walnut and vinegar and warm honey, one woman had 400 pounds of clean, twice-strained, sun-bleached wax stacked in cakes on a shelf, sorted by year. If you have been waiting for the moment everything turns, this is it. It started as whispers. The Kello girls, who had laughed at her for 11 years for crawling under sconces with a pail, stopped laughing and started looking away, which is what mockery becomes when it runs out of ground. Then grudging silence. Then a letter came from Spitalfields, a weaver's wife who needed light steady enough to match warp threads at 4 in the morning and had been told by someone that there was wax in Calverton Parish. 12 dozen. Paid in advance. Then a viscountess. No name on the order, only a steward's hand, an address in Bath, and one line. The source is not to be discussed. 40 pounds of pure white, dipped, not molded, for a house that had opinions about smoke. Then the orders came in a way that stopped being a trickle and started being a road. And on a bright cold morning in September, with the yard still wet and the shed door propped, Silas Brent, the Duke's own Chandler, ruddy across the cheeks, shoulders forward, weight back on his heels, stood in her cottage doorway with his hat held flat against his chest and his tin wick gauge in his breast pocket, needing 1,200 candles for Calverton Hall by Michaelmas, and no house in England able to sell him one. She read Brent's order aloud in the doorway, holding it at arm's length in the last of the light, while behind her the wax cooled in 48 pewter molds and the shed breathed walnut and vinegar and hot tallow. 300 pairs of dipped candles for the Calverton house, 200 more for the tenant cottages, and beneath that, in his cramped hand, the line that mattered. At whatever price the maker names. Hannah Wren folded the paper once and put it in her apron pocket, next to the brass-cornered receipt book with its spine worn pale, and she did not smile. "I'll need it in writing," she said, "all of it." Brent had his hat at his chest and his weight on his heels, and he took the wick gauge out of his breast pocket and turned it over twice like a man saying a rosary, and he said he'd have Mr. Fairley draw it up in the morning. What Fairley drew up was an offer to purchase her stock. Flat sum, clean end, no name on it but the estate's. He came himself to deliver it, ledger under the left arm, chin tucked, spectacles catching the low sun, and he stood in the yard where the kettle steam was still rising and explained, patiently, kindly, the way you'd explain a locked door to a dog, That a woman of her situation could not hold a supply contract with a ducal household, that these things went through channels, that she should be grateful anyone had come at all. "You've had a lucky season," he said. "Don't mistake luck for standing. You're a tenant with a cauldron." 9 words from a man who'd spent 2 years hoping she'd starve quietly. She let him finish. Then she took his own pen, out of his own coat, and she wrote her terms on the back of his offer. £1,840 per annum, delivery in 4 quarters. Her name, Hannah Wren, on the face of the contract, not her landlord's, not the estate's. The stillroom and the shed and every mold in it hers outright, freehold, with the ledger of receipts remaining her property in perpetuity. "Those are my terms," she said, and handed the paper back. He laughed at her. Actually laughed, a dry little cough of a thing, and told her she'd be back at the kitchen door by Lady Day begging for piecework. Here's the beautiful part. Fairley's ledger had a column for everything except the one fact that mattered, that nobody else in England could make a candle that burned 9 hours without guttering, without smoking the plaster black, without the tallow stink that made the great hall unfit by 10 o'clock. Bath had written. 2 milliners in Spitalfields had written. A viscountess who would not name her source had ordered 90 dozen and paid in advance. The estate needed 6,000 candles a year, and the only maker who could supply them was standing in a stained cream apron with her sleeves pinned back above the elbow. He signed. Of course he signed. He signed on the 4th of March with his lips pressed white, and he was never made a villain, and never punished, and never apologized. He was simply made unnecessary, which for a man like Thomas Fairley is worse than a hanging. The Duke came 3 evenings later, alone, no horseboy, no reason. She was skimming a kettle when he stepped in, the gray-blue linen sleeves pinned back, honey-yellow stain across the hip of her apron, loose strands at her temples stuck damp to her skin, the pale thumbprint of a birthmark showing low on the left of her neck above the collar. He stood the way he always stood, military straight, one hand behind his back, and he turned the heavy gold signet ring on his little finger with his thumb, and for a long moment the only sound was fat moving in a copper pot. "I have written to the Vanes," he said. "There will be no match. My mother knows. My steward knows. By Sunday the county will know, and half of it will think me a fool." He didn't dress it. That's what undid her. "I have spent my whole life arranging matters so that nothing could be taken from Calverton," he said, "and I find I would rather lose the whole of it than another evening pretending I came out here about candles." 38 years of composure, spent in 2 sentences. She set the skimmer down on the rim of the kettle. She wiped her wax-glossed left thumb on the apron, out of habit, though it never came clean. "Then don't pretend," she said. "I've no talent for it either." Mrs. Agnes Perry, who had watched the whole business assemble itself from October onward, heard the news from Brent at the servants' table, folded her hands at her waist, went back upstairs to her needlework, and said to the fire without looking up, "He's crossed that yard 400 times this year, not once for the candles." Then she turned her work over and asked whether anyone had trimmed the lamps. They married in June at the county church, where the stone holds the cold even in July. 11 people. The dowager in the front pew with her stick, Brent in a clean collar, hat at his chest, Perry at the back with her keys silent in her hand because she'd wrapped the ring in her shawl so it wouldn't clink through the vows. The work never stopped. It didn't even pause for the wedding. 2 kettles were running that morning, and Hannah checked them at 5 before she dressed. 9 years on, the works employ 12 women, 4 kettles, a drying loft, 62,000 candles a year, and a waiting list that runs to March. Edmund still finds transparent excuses to come down the garden path, and everyone lets him think they're excuses. At dawn, at the kitchen garden gate, Hannah stands with the same tin tray of wick stubs she was carrying the morning all of this began, and hands it across to a young woman with soot on her knuckles. With it, the brass-cornered receipt book, cover worn nearly white now at the spine. "Nothing is ruined," she says, "until someone decides it is." Then she goes in to skim the first kettle. She always does.